Okay, hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here and take a break from my maternity leave, the monotony of my maternity leave, to participate in this wonderful, wonderful lecture, what I know will be a wonderful lecture. It is especially a pleasure to introduce our speaker, Regine Austin Jackson, not only because she has an amazing first name. By the way, my name is Professor Regine Jonchel, for those of you who don't know and don't get the joke. And I'm an associate professor of African and African diaspora studies and Romance languages and literatures. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Jackson today. Regine Austin Jackson is associate professor of sociology and Africana studies at Agnes Scott College in Atlanta. She specializes in Haitian migration and diaspora studies, contemporary Caribbean and African communities in the United States, and place and spatial inequalities. She is the author of Boston Haitians, Navigating Place and Belonging in a Majority-Minority City, and editor of Geographies of the Haitian Diaspora, published by Routledge in 2011. I have to say that the latter especially is a must-read for anyone interested in the field of diaspora studies. It really prompts us to rethink some of the basic premises of the field, and by focusing on the concept of geographies, which she in the intro talks about, Georges Anglade, who's a late Haitian scholar who died in the earthquake. And she writes in that book that, quote, Geographies of the Haitian Diaspora, quote, aims to interrupt the continuity of scholarship on diaspora where binary oppositions between diaspora and territory or identity and place have become commonplace, end quote. And I love that idea of really trying to undo some of these binaries that we get so wedded to in this field of diaspora studies. As an edited volume, it also brings together different scholars working on Haiti from diverse vantage points, which again is, I think, is a really important contribution. So she's not only someone who kind of intellectually is working on Haiti, but is also doing this kind of what we call combi in Haiti, which is a bringing together of a collective of voices. Dr. Jackson has received grants from the American Sociological Association, the Social Science Research Council, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, the Ford Foundation, and the National Foundation for the Humanities. Before joining the faculty at Agnes Scott, she taught at Emory University and the University of Richmond. I first had the pleasure of meeting Professor Jackson when I was a graduate student. And I really appreciated just her insight and her example as a person of Haitian descent whose work was also on Haiti, which in the field of Haitian studies, for better or for worse, the numbers of those of us who are actually from there doing that work are getting smaller and smaller. I also remember the passion with which she approached her subject, or she still approaches her subject, a subject that is close to both of our hearts, Boston's robust Haitian community, which she'll be speaking on today. And again, this is a topic that is of particular interest to us at Boston College. We have a number of people who work at Boston College who are from Boston, members of Boston's Haitian community. And they contribute a lot to the life of this university and the going of this, and the workings of this institution. So I'm excited to welcome Regine to the Boston College community, to introduce her and welcome her, and won't you all join me?
Thank you to the department, AADS, for inviting me. This has been I've been working on this project for quite some time, and I had actually told myself in the effort of getting it off my desk and published that I would stop going around and talking about it and sit down and finalize, finish revising these chapters in the manuscript and get it back to the editor. But I couldn't resist when, I got the email from Dr. Summers, and I heard that BC was doing something and wanted me to present this work. I have to pause to tell a personal story about Regine and our connection. There, we have known each other in multiple capacities for quite some time. And I remember one year at the Haitian Studies Association, we were on a panel, and it was the Regine panel. It was Regine Jean-Charles, Regine La Torture, you remember, who does literature at Brooklyn College, and Regine Jackson. And it really did in some ways represent three very solid cohorts of Haitian scholars who were engaged in this work on Haiti and Black immigrants, and doing it from the space of the academy. And interestingly enough, from the space of not Research One universities, but small colleges who emphasized and understood the importance of research. So the work that I'm going to focus on today comes from my manuscript on the development of the Haitian community in Boston. And the project brings together years of field work. It's a multi-method project that is based on census data, that's based on interviews with Haitian immigrants living in Boston, who have lived in Boston for quite some time, and also Haitians who have returned to Haiti after living in Boston. And I struggled to find a title. Again, this has been a long time in the making, and I struggled to find a title that conveys the central argument of the project. All the great titles were already taken. Sue Modell had written Caribbean Immigrants, a Black Success Story, with a question mark at the end, right? She did this in 1991. Violet Johnson stole the other Black Bostonians in 2006. And even scholars like Phil Casimans, Mary Waters, had already seized on the topic of immigrant incorporation in a majority minority city, their work focusing on New York. And for a long time, the theme of invisibility was very popular in Black immigrant studies, building on the work of Ralph Ellison and a pivotal essay by Roy Bryce Laporte that revived the field in 1972. And when I began this project, almost no one realized that the third largest Haitian community in the United States was in Boston. So I thought that a focus on the invisible Black immigrants in an old immigrant gateway city would fill an important gap in the literature. But by the time I began my fieldwork after my dissertation, I found that Haitians had become quite a presence in Boston, and they were generally well received compared to some of the work that I was reading about Haitians in Miami or Haitians in New York. And so although visibility remains useful in my work as it relates to Haitian businesses and organizations, which were basically non-existent in the 1970s, the goal of the manuscript is really to move beyond these celebratory narratives, these celebratory inward-looking narratives that dominated the field of Black immigrant studies in an earlier phase of development. And the work that I'm doing aims instead to help readers understand the ways that race and place figure in the process of producing Black immigrant communities. And it takes seriously feminist historian Joan Scott's challenge to keep both the necessities and the traps. Let's see, is this working? Is this not plugged in? Here we go. It takes seriously feminist historian Joan Scott's challenge to keep both the necessities and the traps of visibility politics in mind. I needed a title that sends a clear signal that my work was not about immigrants from Haiti who happen to live in Boston. And Boston Haitians, I think, does that for me, although it has some other problems. Individual, on the one hand, my work recounts the achievements of Haitians through stories of immigrants who made Boston their home, but it's not the Black immigrant success story that's become so popular in the media. We know that individual Haitians maybe sometimes can make their way into these narratives about extraordinary people who have worked hard and triumphed against formidable odds. But Haitians as a group collectively are rarely portrayed this way in the literature on Black immigrants. For the most part, Haitians are not the quote-unquote model minority when it comes to immigrant success in the United States. Instead, the image that we have, the image of Haitians that dominates the national imaginary, has always been unequivocally negative. They come from, quote unquote, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, right? Haiti's the only country with the last name, is the joke among Haitian scholars. They carry AIDS. Haitians are boat people. These are the things that we're used to associating with Haitian communities. But Boston Haitians as a title is also easily mistaken as a comment on the kind of Haitian who settled in Boston compared to those who went to New York, Montreal, or Miami. And I'm as uncomfortable with the assumption that all Haitians, including those in the diaspora, the assumption that they're fundamentally the same, this essentialist position, as I am with the selectivity arguments that come from the presumption that people in Haiti are significantly divided by social class, between the haves and the have-nots, the elite and the illiterate, the God-fearing and the voodoo practitioners, right? All of these sort of ideas occupy, and I would say sort of muddy the work on Haitian immigrants, especially when we start to point out differences in their experiences. Class background becomes a major explanatory factor. Boston Haitians as a title also resembles claims that culture explains why Haitians are quote unquote making it in Boston in a way that African Americans have not. Books with titles such as The Boston Irish or The Jews of Boston, Boston Italians, all of these works on immigrants to Boston tend to cast African Americans in the troubling role of culturally and personally deficient outsiders, as if their lives somehow unfolded in a vacuum. And the recurrent sort of paeans in the literature to the immigrant work ethic and the preoccupation with West Indian success in the sociology of immigration tend to ignore the shared structural obstacles that African Americans and Black immigrants face in the struggle against equality and exclusion in urban America. So I wanted to do something that departed from these, these typical narratives, and to move away from a focus on the Haitian underclass, as well as the cultural and social class explanations of Black immigrant success. Instead, Boston Haitians looks at the Black immigrant experience through the lens of place. And I'll say a little bit more about that, but for the sociologists in the room, I always feel like I need to say something about method, right? We want to know, well, what is this based on? And so I wanted to say that, the work, again, is based on a combination of field work, secondary data analysis, observations in Haitian places. Starting from the work that I did for my dissertation, I lived in Boston. I'm from Boston. I lived in Boston in several years. Did a postdoc, a Ford postdoc, where I continued to collect data to build on what I collected and reported in previous work. And rather than the typical procedure followed in face-to-face interviews, I conducted what's called life story or narrative interviews. And narrative interviews are slightly different in that they don't sort of steer respondents to particular areas of questioning. They're much more open-ended. They're much more collaborative in that way. As an interviewer, I saw my role as encouraging respondents to elaborate on the stories that they were telling with open-ended questions and prompts. And although I had a semi-structured guide, the interview protocol was not fully scripted, right? It tried to follow a design that really sort of allowed people to tell stories and for stories to evolve over time. The analytic approach I take in my research is what I call a critical structural perspective, and this is where I look very closely at the experiences that are narrated or told to me, and really trying to think through the causes and effects of the racial and ethnic disparities that I knew existed from the other data that I was looking at. And one of the things that I argue is that if we really want to understand the prospects for contemporary Black immigrants, it's important to consider the places immigrants have settled. For some migration scholars, this falls under the heading of context of reception. That's Alex Cortez and Ruben Brumbaugh's phrase. However, I prefer the concept of place, because in addition to the national economic and social context, I try to account for the role of symbolic resources in the experiences of immigrants. Things like the culture of the city, its ethos, public image, or brand. And while I acknowledge that social relations and collective identity are lived in transnational and global fields, I argue that the local still matters. Local discourses determine how immigrants are interpolated and racialized, and the strategies that are available to them to negotiate belonging. And place of settlement in my work, in all of my work, not just this project, is more than just a backdrop or a settlement or a setting. I argue that it's a stimulus or a factor in the incorporation of contemporary immigrants. So I consider how they've transformed the places they find themselves and how place works as a vehicle for immigrant success. We're very accustomed to talking about how race takes on changing and contradictory meanings in dynamic interaction with other forms of power and privilege, such as class or gender. And I've asked audiences and readers to think about and consider the mediating effects of place. And I'm not trying to suggest that there's something exceptional about Boston, but there's a different sense of place that exists in the city as a reception context for Black immigrants. And it was very much part of my motivation for doing this work. Based on my own family's experiences, I began this project with insights about how being Haitian in Boston compared to living in Miami, New York, Montreal, Philadelphia, or Providence, and how place shapes the prospects and encounters that Black immigrants have in urban America. Isn't this awful? I show a personal picture, but it's not. I'm not the one Black girl in the picture, right? That's my sister. I would never, do that to myself. A picture from 1980. But again, there's a personal connection here. After migrating to New York in the late 1960s, my parents moved to Boston in 1976. And rather than following other Haitians from Brooklyn to Cambria Heights, the middle-class neighborhood in Queens that was very popular at that time, my parents purchased a two-family home on the Dorchester side of a neighborhood that borders Mattapan and Roxbury, and rented the first floor below market value to one Haitian family after another, until my sister and her family finally assumed the mortgage. They worked alongside a growing number of Haitians in service and manufacturing jobs until their retirements. Days off were filled with errands in Mattapan Square and an endless stream of family and friends dropping by to eat, gossip, listen to music, or deliver their share of the MET, the Rotating Credit Association that financed so many of our vacations and other endeavors. In addition to the weekly masses and the monthly ritual of mailing a check in the small parish envelope addressed to the rectory, they sent my siblings and I, and later my nieces and nephew, to Catholic schools. Most of their grandchildren were baptized in the same neighborhood church where their children and their friends' children celebrated first communions and confirmations. And none of this is to say that my parents were spared any of the consequences of American city life for Black immigrants who lose children of the second generation to murder, prison, or deportation. Like many Black families, mine dealt with issues other issues prevalent in inner city areas of Boston, the urban violence, unplanned pregnancies, discrimination, encounters with racist police, declining neighborhoods, and single parenthood. But being Haitian in Boston is more than the sum of successes and failures for my parents and their milieu. Boston as an idea and as a physical place plays a significant role in the experiences narrated by the Haitians I study. Their maps of the city include places they only know from their cars, museums, sports arenas, or concert halls, in addition to most places that people from Boston don't even know exist. In-home daycare centers, basement dressing salons, and dining room accountant services organized by and for other Haitian residents. And in Boston, Haitians, I demonstrate that after almost 50 years, Haitians are a part of a critical mass of Black immigrants that has transformed the landscape, the representational feel, and the rhythm of Boston. And perhaps it's because Haitians account for approximately 50% of Boston's Caribbean immigrants, but like middle-class African Americans in suburban residential enclaves, Haitians inhabit a social, economic, and political environment here in Boston where being Haitian has some advantages and a symbolic value. Boston may never replace Haiti as home, but Haitians are part of the city's history, and they see themselves as integral to its future. When my narrators talk about their lives, their accounts include local events and experiences that root them to the city. How many of you are from Boston? I see the woman in the back is sort of going yes and no. How long have you been in Boston?
Well, I was born there,
Mhm.
but then I moved to Rhode Island when I was 7, so I did like first, second grade in Boston.
Okay.
But I did METCO, so
Uh-huh.
my schooling was in Boston, but I'm aware like the environment.
Okay. Anybody else? Anybody been here longer than 25, 30 years?
You're not talking about me, right?
Remember that.
So my
Remember
dad
that.
came in 1963, right, which you know, and though I grew up in Wellesley, we're very much Boston Haitians because of our various involvement. Both my parents, worked in Dorchester, well, in Roxford and Dorchester, and we went to San Angelo's and all that.
Right. So I left Boston when I was 18 to go to college. But over the years, I've noted the different kinds of reactions I get when I tell people I'm from Boston. All right. On the one hand, some white Americans, right? People who I meet, they're delighted. They're just like, oh, Boston, what a great city, right? Inevitably, though, when I talk to other Black people who are not from here, and I tell them I'm from Boston, they grimace, they sort of, or they have this reaction that suggests that Boston signifies something different for them. And some people have this sense of Boston, the old Boston, what I call the old Boston, right? The Boston of Irish pubs, Italian enclaves, but not a Boston with a real minority presence. And some of you will recall the photograph that's on the screen. This is of Joseph Frakes about to assault a Black lawyer and civil rights activist, Ted Lansmark, with a flagpole. This is during the Boston desegregation of school, the battle for the desegregation of schools. And this image has really sort of marred the image of Boston in the popular imagination, especially for Black Americans. The city's reputation as the quote-unquote Athens of America went very quickly to the Little Rock of the North. And Boston attracted national attention when racial tensions erupted in the form of turf wars and the anti-busing movement, whites violently protested court-ordered desegregation of the Boston public schools. And by 1975, images of raging mobs confronting armies of police and white youth hurling bottles and rocks at buses carrying terrified school children on their way to school really transformed Boston's image. And it's important to note, on the one hand, the picture is alarming. Stanley Forman won a Pulitzer Prize for this image. And the image, is very powerful in a number of ways. But I also want to draw your attention to the date, right? This was happening a full 20 years after Brown v. Board, of the Brown v. Board case of desegregation. And in fact, this same year that this photograph was taken, former Alabama Governor George Wallace, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, right? This was George Wallace's mantra. He was running for president for the second time in 1976, and he won the Massachusetts Democratic presidential primary that year. This is a photograph of Yvonne Jean-Louis, a Haitian immigrant who was attacked by white protesters in the neighborhood of South Boston. This is another event in some ways that was widely reported, but the first black resident almost killed in the crossfire was not the African-American activist from Roxbury, but an immigrant from Haiti. This is the Boston that Haitians encountered in the late 1960s and 1970s. The New York Times described Jean-Louis. They missed the fact that he was Haitian, that he was a Haitian immigrant, unlike the Agna Lima incident that in 1999, where his immigrant background was a major part of the reporting and the way that that event is remembered and the activism that developed from it. In 1974, the New York Times just described him as a black who happened by, a man who carelessly disregarded the city's racial geography. Even the Boston Globe described the incident in broad racial terms. Whites chase, beat black man. And throughout his attack, Yvonne Jean-Louis desperately tried to stave off the angry mob, shouting, "I'm not black, I'm not black." And Haitians in the 1970s repeatedly invoked Jean-Louis' experience and the brutal beating in discussions about whether and where they could make it in the city. But 30 years later, most of the people I interviewed considered the incident ancient history. City officials and community leaders have also been working hard to change the perception of Boston from the Little Rock of the North. As soon as the data from the 2000 census was released, commentators and scholars also joined in announcing that for the first time in its history, Boston was a majority-minority city. Blacks, Hispanics, and Asians constituted over 50% of inner-city residents. In their book, Barry Bluestone and Mary Stevenson described what was going on in Boston as a revolution, arguing that demographically, the greater Boston region moved from a white ethnocentric community to a diverse multicultural one, and in a relatively brief amount of time. The minority population tripled between 1950 and 1970 and then doubled again to 40.9% in the next 20 years. Immigration was a big part of this transformation. Since the end of World War II, the city has attracted growing numbers of Latin American, Caribbean, Asian, and African migrants who added not only cultural but racial diversity to the historic Irish and Italian immigration that dominated the city. Like many other cities, Boston had experienced population decline and economic restructuring at the end of World War II. The population was began a dramatic decline after reaching a peak in 1950. After that, the population really started to tank, and people were worried about whether or not Boston could ever sort of resume its greatness. But by the 1980s, the city reemerged as one of the most successful U.S. cities following a wave of city building, a high-tech revolution, and economic diversification. And notably, Boston became an immigrant city again. After decades of population decline and low numbers of foreign-born, it reclaimed its status as an immigrant gateway. But this time, they were mostly immigrants of color. The foreign-born population grew by 2010, Boston had the 6th highest proportion of foreign-born residents among the 25 largest cities. Boston was in the process of reinventing itself much before the 2000 census. Business and municipal leaders tried to create a welcoming context that included requiring city agencies to devote resources to immigrants, the development of bilingual education programs, community liaison positions, and the recruitment of translators. Immigration was a frequent topic in the media, and local politicians took an immigrant-friendly stance. The rhetoric that surrounded the Massachusetts miracle in the 1980s, for example, emphasized regeneration and reinvention, and the image of Boston became a concern among business and municipal leaders. They wanted to rescue the city from the negative publicity of the 1970s, and racial reconciliation was as much a part of that miracle or renaissance as jobs or some sort of economic revitalization. White politicians who had built careers on their supposed ability to hold minorities at bay lost power. One of my respondents describes the shift in the local political climate. She says, in 1982, 1983, the whole business of gaining political capital by promoting racial divisions was over. It was all over. The defeat of Hicks and Harrigan was a signal to all white politicians who had benefited from racial division that Boston was not going to put up with that anymore. Ray Flynn came up a great deal in this discussion of the sort of renaissance or the transformation of Boston. When Flynn appointed a Haitian police officer named Yves D'Ambleville as the mayor's liaison to the Caribbean and Haitian communities, it signaled that Haitians were included in Flynn's concern for city residents. D'Ambleville had been a police officer in Boston since 1978, and he seemed like the ideal choice for Flynn, given the importance of healing the rift between the Boston Police Department and the Black community. Haitians at a community meeting talked about how different it was to be, quote unquote, on the inside, to attend council meetings and to be able to call legislators or the mayor on the telephone. As one respondent put it, in the 1970s, no Haitian would have been able to see a city council member. Now we're elected officials. We can call the mayor and expect to speak to him. One of my respondents echoed this sentiment in a story about Flynn marching with Haitians in response to the coup in Haiti that ousted democratically elected President Jean-Bertrand Aristide in 1991. He said it was Flynn, the mayor of Boston, that led a crowd of spontaneous demonstrators gathered in downtown Boston. Just imagine, 2,500 to 3,000 people were shouting, "We want Aristide." The Haitian Consul General of Boston, the Vice Consul, spoke, and after all the speeches, everyone sang, "We shall overcome." So the transformation that I'm trying to capture, or the transformation that I'm trying to describe, is not just about population shifts or economic resurgence. A key part of my argument is that the identity of the city, its sense of place, was remade as a result of conscious attention to race and the city's racial reputation. place marketing became a prominent feature of the city's development strategy. And the sense of pride in breaking from its past and welcoming new immigrants is evidenced discursively in recurring phrases like the new Boston, 21st century Boston, or global Boston. And because Haitians and other Black immigrant groups, Afro-Puerto Ricans, Cape Verdeans, and English-speaking West Indians, have a longer history in the city than some of the other new immigrants, they benefited from the remaking of contemporary Greater Boston in noticeable ways. And I'm not just saying this because I'm at DC, but the Catholic Church was is very significant player here. But on a number of indicators, Haitians have experienced a level of collective success in Boston that's not replicated in other major sites of the Haitian diaspora. The Catholic Church is significant here, and in the 1970s and 80s, Catholic churches were an important node for community development and the production of locality. At first, Haitians worshipped in predominantly Irish Catholic or Italian American parishes, but over time, 3 Catholic churches in Dorchester and Mattapan, St. Leo's, St. Matthew, and St. Angela, became the symbol of the Haitian community. The founding of the Haitian Multi-Service Center in 1978 at St. Leo's by community leaders also signaled that they were laying claim to these religious institutions that were the powerful source of a local identity. In many ways, their passports to the lower middle class were the jobs, neighborhoods, and local institutions that middle-class whites had fled. And chief among them were neighborhood churches and parish schools. Economically, Haitians were represented in a range of mainstream and middle-class occupations. And they've also developed some viable ethnic enterprises. For many working-class Haitians, affirmative action programs established at Boston College in 1973, the Boston Police Department in 1974, and the Bank of Boston in 1978 proved to be crucial to their economic incorporation. A local office of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission opened in Boston in January 1984, and middle-class Haitians took advantage of race-based programs and white-collar job growth during the Massachusetts Miracle. According to one of my narrators, Haitians were the beneficiaries of attempts to hire more blacks in the sciences. There weren't many blacks in some of these fields. For example, when General Electric and other engineering firms were here, Haitians were hired at a very high rate. Haitian intellectuals also found jobs in Black studies programs. Haitians also began to occupy leadership positions in a variety of service, professional, and cultural organizations. Many were homeowners, many of the people I interviewed were homeowners, suggesting that they were putting down roots in the city. And the 2- and 3-decker homes that were widely available in Dorchester in the 1970s for $24,000, $26,000, $32,000. These homes created a new class of Haitian landlords and gave Haitian renters a low-cost alternative to public housing. Like the Irish and Italian immigrants before them, Haitians would use the rent from the other units to pay the mortgage on some of these structures. And these 3-deckers came to represent the good life to Haitian immigrants coming from New York or Montreal, in that they approximated independent, home-owning, middle-class Americans. And this available stock of older housing proved to be a significant safeguard against some of the neighborhood-level hazards of urban living, allowing for multi-generational, cross-class households. These structures provide social support networks for even the weakest Haitian families in my study. Haitians were also becoming an influential constituency in local politics. Very early in 1999, the highest ranking Haitian immigrant officials in the United States served in Boston, and this represented a level of success in the Haitian diaspora that we hadn't seen elsewhere. I want to come back to this image of Marie Saint-Clair and say a little bit more. But even when we consider the most durable measures of inequality in the U.S., Haitians seem to be doing better than other blacks and racialized immigrants in Boston. This slide is from the NAS survey, the National Asset Scorecard and Communities of Color project, which is a multi-city study that, very recent multi-city study that looks at the asset and debt positions of various racial and ethnic groups. And the goal, I'm a consultant on this project for the Boston survey, and the goal is to collect information about net worth. And my mentor, Sandy Darity, William Darity from Duke University, called me up one summer and said, we've got this really interesting information about Boston, and we need you to help us make sense of it. And this is what they were trying to explain and to make sense of, contrary to all of the ways that they had been thinking about Haitian communities and their relative positions in terms of inequality. One of the things that the NAS survey found and documented was that Haitians are doing much better compared in terms of asset ownership, home ownership, savings accounts, stocks and bonds, and these things when you compare them to other communities of color in the Boston metropolitan area. And this was, again, sort of revolutionary in terms of what they were learning about the asset positions of these subgroups. But it's these two photographs of Yvonne Jean-Louis being attacked in 1974 and Marie Saint-Clair and Tom Riley. This is the day that he announced that he had chosen Marie Saint-Clair as his candidate for lieutenant governor in 2006. And this is the image that really illustrates the simultaneous experience of enduring inequalities and symbolic inclusion that's at the center of my remarks today. The picture the picture of relative success of Haitian immigrants is partial at best. Just like the incorporation of Boston Haitians has been somewhat uneven. Just as Greater Boston's transformation from a predominantly white to a majority minority place has also been somewhat uneven. And for many race scholars, the terms post-racial or majority minority, especially in reference to places like Boston, are extremely problematic. Racial discrimination and inequality are persistent problems. And the city, the metropolitan area, although diversifying in some areas, is still very much predominantly white. If you move outside, if you adjust the scale of geography, move outside the city of Boston, you find that the suburbs and some of the outlying areas are close to 90% white. And this has been a persistent sort of disparity in terms of residential segregation that's held on since the 1970s, the 1980s. Boston is paradoxically in one of the most segregated metropolitan areas in its size, and also in one of the only two states to ever elect an African American governor, right? It's a sort of contradictory space in that way. And members of the Haitian community describe experiences that call into question whether the embrace of a post-racial framing of intergroup relations is enough to combat black-white inequality, especially racial segregation and economic and political marginalization in the long run. And the significance of race was obvious in the experiences of some of my narrators. Claude says, there's no little Haiti here, no little San Juan or Kingston either. Boston is not a minority city. It's not like Atlanta or Washington, D.C., where blacks are really in the mainstream. It's just not a minority city. He was very vocal that there were lots of things that challenged this idea. And one of the things that I argue is that even when we look at the spaces that are designated as Haitian spaces in the city, Mattapan is the area that's synonymous. It accompanies almost every reference to Haitians in the city of Boston, has become this site of community building and placemaking and these things that I argue are very important, but they're also spaces that demonstrate how racial segregation and economic disinvestment has affected certain parts of the city. The city, during the 1980s, 1990s, the city undertook this project, and what I argue is a racial project, of remaking the city's neighborhoods and marketing them, right? These ethnic neighborhoods as quaint and charming because of their ethnic flair or the cuisine, the unique cuisine that they offered. And yet, when we look critically at the ways that Boston is positioned as a majority minority city, and spaces like Mattapan and Roxbury and a number of other inner city neighborhoods are referred to as black space, we start to see that these are mechanisms for controlling or for ordering the spaces of the city and the people of the city as well. These ideas that Haitians belong in Mattapan, but perhaps not in other spaces of the city where there are greater opportunities. Even among respondents with professional occupations and high household incomes, many report that they're living paycheck to paycheck. For instance, Natalie is a 50-year-old native of Haiti who, as an elementary school principal, earns a high salary and has a graduate degree, but she says, everything I have is because I work. We're not well enough that if something were to happen to me, we could survive for more than 6 months tops. It's all dependent on me waking up and going to work and getting paid every other week. There's no investments, there's no businesses, it's just me getting up every day. People might look at my salary and think I'm doing very well, but it's all contingent on me going to work. So for this respondent, her professional occupation, her level of education were not perceived as ways to generate wealth or that helped her in terms of economic stability. She described these things as necessities to make ends meet in Boston and to survive economically, given the high cost of living and the high cost of real estate. Notably, Natalie does not own a home. Her housing costs are kept at a minimum, in part because she lives with family members. And she had some very interesting ideas and things to share about her experiences growing up in Boston. And again, this example of economic insecurity was shared across occupational strata. Sabine is 45 years old. She's been a police officer with the MBTA since July 1997, excuse me. She was born in Haiti but migrated to Boston in 1986 when she settled in Dorchester. She has a bachelor's degree and some additional years of study. But in following a conversation that we had about her last vacation, she explained that she doesn't consider herself poor, but she sometimes feels like she's barely getting by. I have a job where I'm fortunate enough where I can work overtime. If I foresee certain things that need to be paid, I can just work more. So I'm fortunate in that regard. But it's just that if I made more money, I wouldn't have to work overtime. I just have the opportunity where others do not. And this is a person who self-reports that she can earn an average of $20,000 additional dollars in income in overtime wages, getting time and a half, and yet she still describes barely getting by in Boston. Even among homeowners, Haitian homeowners, explained that they still experienced economic and social insecurity. Richard is 67 years old. He currently lives with his 28-year-old son in Stoughton, and he describes how unexpected expenses presented a challenge for him, and how he had to strategize to be able to pay off a high hospital bill. Other respondents describe how high mortgage costs and the housing crisis in 2008 have really wreaked havoc on some of their major assets, or the principal form of wealth that they had in the city of Boston. I will move this along. And you know, some respondents talked explicitly about race in their experiences, and how race continues to shape some of the difficulties and obstacles that they face in a majority minority city. It's not racism that's constantly in your face like maybe the southern states, but it's more under the radar. It's a little different. You know how people will try to sabotage you because of your color. It's been like that ever since I got here and went to elementary school. Sometimes I wonder how it feels to just go into a job and not have to deal with all that stuff. I wonder if I can just do my job. I don't know what that feels like. And so, even the multifamily houses that I described as sort of pivotal in terms of positioning Haitians in Boston as an indicator of their success, these structures have disadvantages that go along with them. Again, the neighborhoods where many of these homes are located have been the sites of extreme economic disinvestment and neglect over the years. These were the city's chief sort of architecture in the 1970s, and they've lost a number of units to arson and vandalism, economic deterioration since the early 1970s. So what I'm trying to argue here is that Haitians are sort of stuck between this experience of inclusion and successful incorporation in the city of Boston, and also the continuing sort of effects of racial inequality, of neoliberal economic policies that play themselves out in American urban spaces, where economic development and growth and marketing places as attractive to international, marketing Boston as a global place that's attractive to international, multinational businesses and corporations at the expense of some investment in social and human capital investment projects. And this has been part of the story of Boston that Haitians have experienced, right? Coming in the 1970s, when the racism was blatant, and some of the economic downturn was really prevalent in their experiences, to riding this wave in the 1980s of the quote-unquote Massachusetts miracle into the current moment, where Haitians are positioned in a unique place, I would argue, coming from Jean-Louis' pronouncement, as he was, being attacked to "he's not black, he's not black." Haitians have really moved into a position in Boston where they are representing blackness in a particular way, especially to outsiders. And I know this is a somewhat controversial thing to say, and that's why I'm not saying it tomorrow when you have your Blacks in Boston conference. Because there are different ways of establishing belonging for Blacks in the city of Boston. For the African American community, again, that belonging may be rooted more in Boston's abolitionist history, its rich history of African American activism. And for its Black immigrant populations, that narrative of belonging is based on other experiences in neighborhoods that used to belong to Irish immigrants, in that process of ethnic secession, in that narrative of becoming successful. I heard many Haitians talk about the Irish weren't accepted when they got here either, right? And we're just like the Irish and Italians. We're moving into the mainstream in that, we're having that experience of upward mobility. We've got everything in the community to make that happen. And as scholars looking at Black immigrant communities, my goal is to move forward, to think about how some of these narratives, how some of these experiences are rooted in the places where they occur, right? That place actually functions as an important mechanism for creating these narratives. The fact that Boston Haitians were part of that racial reconciliation, that racial renaissance in Boston has been a powerful theme in their experiences over time. And the 5 dimensions of place that I use in my work, again, focus on thinking seriously, critically about a place's history, its population, geographical and spatial dimensions of place in terms of place making and spatial inequality, but also looking and thinking about the public culture and the ethos of a place. Boston has been transformed over the years, from the Athens of America to the Little Rock of the North to the new Boston, and Haitians have been an important part of that transformation. I'm going to end here. I've been talking for 50 minutes. How are we doing? Yes. It was strange to have everyone on this. I didn't think I should have let you do your thing. You know this room better than I do. Yes.
So thank you for the talk. You mentioned towards the end that African American activism has been central to, or activism has been essential to African Americans in the sense of belonging in Boston. And that was one of the things I was thinking as you were giving your talk is the inclusion of Haitians in the Massachusetts miracle. To what extent was that also propelled by activism? Were there points where Haitians are kind of exerting pressure on private businesses, government, political establishment in order to be included in this Massachusetts miracle, and what did that look like?
And in some ways, I think the pressure was coming from the African American community, the more established Black community in Boston. And what happened with the Haitian community was really by necessity, right? You had this growth in the Haitian community from the 1970s to 1980s. There was a huge sort of growth in the population in that one decade. And that, the new sort of immigrant communities mandated culturally and linguistically, a diverse workforce, right? All of a sudden we needed translators working at Boston City Hospital. We needed to think more seriously about bilingual education programs in schools. And in those places, Haitians were very active, very vocal in creating those kinds of niches that were part of this Massachusetts miracle, part of the expansion of the jobs. The jobs at the top, the white collar jobs, those were other kinds of pushes, right, that created those openings. But as, you know, as Boston became sort of bifurcated in terms of becoming a information and education hub, it needed these service positions. And Haitians really did fill this niche. And so it was twin pressures, right, in terms of the activist pressures that created the openings for meaningful change at all levels, and then the demands that were generated by the diversity, the really quick diversity of the population, the city's residents. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for your talk. It's great. I was fascinated to hear that your informants were telling you about remembering Ray Flynn, because I think of his opponent in the 1983 race, Mel King, who the son of Barbadian immigrants, who probably did more to move Ray Flynn toward doing a lot of those things than you know he ever got.
And you didn't even raise your hand when I said who was from Boston, and you have
Oh, no, I'm not. I'm just a historian, so I know.
Gotcha.
I didn't come here until 20 years ago. So did you hear anything? Did anyone talk about Mel King, or was he just completely out of the picture?
And that's what was, I mean, that's what was so interesting in some of how people were talking, right? On the one hand, Yvonne Louis doesn't, his sort of position that he's not black and wanting to distance himself from the African American community, that was one strand of response to what was going on in Boston in the late 70s and early 80s. Another strand was really it really developed a certain kind of racial consciousness among Haitian residents who talk about, going to Northeastern and marching with students and having to explain their afros and dashikis and things like that to their Haitian parents who thought, who had a very classic immigrant sort of expectation of their children, that they would work hard, they would get good grades, and they would become doctors and engineers and nurses and teachers and things like that. And so there were many people who were inspired by Mel King and what he offered, especially this movement. If I talk about the Mandela sort of movement in the 1980s by African Americans to separate from the city, I think that became a big sort of turning point for Haitians when the incorporation strategy really shifted decisively toward assimilation and incorporation rather than separatism. Right, to the extent that Haitians were involved at all in these conversations. Remember, this is the 1980s. This is François Duvalier. This is the era of François Duvalier, and Haitians are very much occupied by things that are going on in Haiti and throughout the diaspora. And in some ways, this shift in terms of thinking of themselves as a Boston community, that local identity really starts to crystallize in the 1990s. And so it happens after Mel King, and so Mel King wasn't as important to all Haitians in that same way.
Hi, this was a great talk, very compelling. I do a lot of research on Black immigrants and African Americans in New York City. And so I know you're doing something a lot more in-depth in Boston on Haitians. And I'm trying to figure out the landscape of Boston, right? You talked a little bit about racial residential segregation and what that means for the incorporation of Haitians and their children, but is it that when Haitians were coming in, they were coming
And that's an important part of the story and their experiences, especially the initial, the sort of pioneers, right, who ventured into Boston. And the fact that they could sidestep Roxbury and public housing projects in Boston was a big deal for Haitians. Some of my respondents talk about how significant that it was that they settled in neighborhoods in Dorchester and Mattapan that were still predominantly white or predominantly Jewish, right? Though that didn't last for long with white flight and the ways that these neighborhoods evolved over time. But that was a very significant factor in terms of their ability to move into these spaces. And it really was partly because of the nature, again, in the 1970s when Boston attracted all of that negative attention, white flight was part of the reason, right? There was this sort of urban crisis in Boston at that moment, and Haitians really were able to take advantage of some of the openings that existed in ways that African American communities, partly because of, when we look at these generalizations, Haitians were a small community at that point, and so, as with small populations, it's easier for them to be dispersed or to look dispersed in particular ways. I published a piece that mapped different Haitian residences when they first arrived in the city, and one of the things that I found was that the location of Catholic churches was important for them. It's interesting how these neighborhoods in Mattapan and Dorchester around Catholic churches became, these sort of central sites for Haitian community building. And even celebratory things like the Haitian, what is it called? In 1974, Haitians had the first sort of Haitian Day Parade, right? And it proceeded from Mattapan Square down Blue Hill Avenue, and that was a significant sort of marker that they had their own space in the city, right? That it didn't start in Roxbury, or that it wasn't limited to that quote unquote, typical black space of the city, that they were expanding the boundaries for blacks in Boston. And so that was a significant moment that the Haitian Day Parade and the Caribbean Day Parade, Caribbean Carnival in Boston occupied that space, and that's been going on since the 1970s.
So, yes, okay, good presentation. It seems like how you say that racial discrimination still persists. That's right. And then you also say that it is there under the radar. How are you now? You know it's there. How do you deal with it?
Right, and that is, that's the $1 million question in some ways. And some Haitians talk about dealing with it explicitly and call it, there's a lot of sort of Haitian pride in the Haitian Revolution and the accomplishments of Haitians as a people, right? And they, I've heard Haitians talk. One of my respondents told a story about how her son was being picked on at school, and rather than back down or what have you, he fought back and came home, sort of roughed up, and she was so proud of him that she said he had the blood of Dessalines, right? that he wasn't going to let these white kids sort of push him around, and so there's that sort of idea about how to deal with the racism that exists in the United States, but that they experience specifically in Boston because of the nature of the turf wars and the sense of who belongs in what space. But then there's also a very strong, especially among community leaders and older members of the community, that that Boston has been good to them, right? That they have been able to achieve things in Boston that they couldn't have achieved elsewhere. And that and it's only as they start to experience, as the second and third generation start to really come up against these racialized obstacles to success, that some Haitians are actually starting to talk about race more explicitly. But there has been, like I mentioned, this sort of incorporationist or, make the system work for us, right? That we've got this Haitian community that's growing, that's vibrant, and to put the energy there in terms of growing the Haitian community, or to put the energy back home in Haiti, that there are so many problems, there are so many opportunities for a different kind of life, right? That Boston becomes not home in that way, even for residents who've been here for 30, 40 years. They still think of that spot in Jacmel or that spot in Cap Haitien as home, and that's where their energy is really devoted. So it's complicated. I think the answer that you're looking for really lies with the second and third generations of Haitian ethnics in Boston.
I think I'm a first generation immigrant, and I came around that time where Yvon Jean-Louis was saying he's not Haitian. I remember that, I was in high school, but that's another spectrum. I came to Cambridge. That's where my mother was, and my uncle, and my uncle's wife. So I think people tend to go where they have relatives or friends.
Right.
And from Cambridge, they have friends in Somerville. And then now gentrification and Cambridge is getting expensive, so people are moving to Malden and going as far as Fall River.
Right.
Yeah, so gentrification, so Haitians are living all over Massachusetts. So now I think we have to look at like the whole Massachusetts where Haitians are moving to. But it's interesting. Also, I'm looking at things from an educator's perspective, and I don't see that in education. So we have been a generation that went to college and is educated, but I'm looking at the third generation, those born in, let's say 2000, 1995, I think there's a benchmark there, where those kids are not getting the education that we really want them to have. And you mentioned the Irish. I think what we need to start doing, we need to start having after school, we need to start having schools, probably invest in the charter schools, start educating the kids. We are losing the culture, we are losing the kids, so that generation coming is not doing as well as my, the first and the second generation. So I think we have an issue here.
And on the one hand, there is a generational split, right? In terms of attitudes toward education, in terms of educational attainment and things like that. But it's precisely that generation that you're talking about, born in the mid-1990s or early 2000s, who at this point are becoming very disillusioned with the idea that education is the panacea, right? That education is going to solve all of their problems. Some of my younger narrators also talk about how they are saddled with school debt, school loans, right? That is really preventing them from moving forward, or really starting to question why all this emphasis on education, spending all of this money to get these degrees when there are no jobs, or people are discriminated against on the job market. And again, it's that consciousness that comes from not just the place where they're settled, right, in Boston, but also the historical context of their experiences. And I think that that's one of the dilemmas of within the Haitian community, of trying to deal with the fact that this third, and many of them are at this point third generation, right? This second and third generation removed from Haiti, they are having very different experiences in Boston in terms of because of race and what they perceive to be the sort of continuing racism that they experience. And it was interesting that you brought up Cambridge, because Cambridge is one of those places where Haitian communities started to develop in the late 60s and 70s, and it was getting rid of rent control, really, that in Cambridge, that had a big impact on the community sort of settling and moving elsewhere.
So I'm thinking about when we're looking at a gentleman who was saying, I'm not Black, and you mentioning that Haitians are now seeing themselves as representative of Blacks and really integrated into the Boston community. But is that like mixing in and seeing themselves as part of the African American community, or as still as separate other Blacks, like as separate Black immigrants who are now in Boston? So understanding that they're experiencing racism because one is pigmented in America and that's going to happen, but as part of Blacks in America, like is there an integration of a unity there that happens after being here for so long?
And yes and no, right? On the one hand, you know, there is an investment in sort of maintaining a strong sense of identification with Haiti and Haitians in a way that happens in Boston again, that I think is distinct from what happened. You know, some of the scholars that write about Haitians in Miami, Alex Stepik's work, and some others who talk about how difficult it is, or how historically difficult it was for Haitians to identify as Haitian in those spaces, right? That there was all of this sort of Haitian undercover business sort of going on in Miami that that some scholars think is very central to the Haitian experience in the U.S., right? Wanting to deny that they are Haitian and claim other kinds of identities. And I think some of that was part of the Haitian experience early on, especially as the Red Cross banned Haitian blood, right, in the 1990s, when Haitians were designated as the only ethnic group associated for high risk of AIDS by the CDC. You know, it was hookers, hemophiliacs, heroin addicts, and Haitians, right? This 4-H club, right? And so people talk about how in those moments that the distancing from their Haitianness was a kind of survival strategy. And I think that because of that experience, because of that collective experience, that the Haitian community now has reached a point where they are asserting their belonging in Boston and in the United States, right? As a formerly marginalized, disparaged group, saying that we had these same kinds of experiences during the busing crisis as African Americans did, right? We have these same sort of difficult encounters with racist police. We have these same sort of experiences of trying to, be incorporated politically in the city of Boston. Right, the city of Boston has never elected an African American, has never elected a Black mayor, right? And that includes a West Indian or Haitian mayor, right? Even though we see certain political figures really sort of symbolically positioned in these spaces, we still haven't seen the kind of local political incorporation along with the African American community, right? So there are things that Haitians talk about that they share with African Americans and other Blacks at the same time that they emphasize their distinctiveness, right? And so moving away from this either or, moving away from this dichotomy, right? Either you're Haitian or you're African American, and thinking about how both and are very much possible, and how local experiences in particular neighborhoods and events in Boston have really been important to the kind of identity that they have crafted for themselves. Does that begin to answer your question? It's a tough question because a lot of the literature out there really suggests that these Black immigrant communities and African American communities are fundamentally at odds, in conflict. And, I think there are moments of cooperation that deserve greater attention. There are moments of similarities in their experiences that deserve greater attention.
We have time for one more question. I have 3, so. I mean, and I thought I could ask my
And she's gonna ask them all.
I was gonna wait, but if nobody else has a question.
I just want to say, like, I don't know if you've seen the report by UMass did that I think the Haitians are not, I think the Haitians are the largest foreigners. So I think, we have to start investing, like you mentioned that, like the asset that we have. So we have to start investing, start having our own businesses, not to rely on jobs. I think the economy, like the recession that taught us a lesson where, jobs are not permanent.
Right.
So we have to learn from that, start being more creative with our assets and start investing in our jobs for the next generation.
Right, and that's absolutely the strategy that works. And one of the things about this space, and one of the ways I sort of try to say that the transformation is partial and incomplete, right, that's happened in Boston, is that there isn't necessarily the kind of fertile space that you would imagine for those kinds of enterprises, right, for that kind of solid community formation and economic stability, right? For a number of reasons, ways that the city and the people who are, selling the city in particular ways are not necessarily concerned that the local communities are able to, have the kind of quality of life that you might imagine is possible, right? It is this way that American cities are very much evidencing some of these policies and practices that suggest that social programs and local economic development is not as important as some other things that make the city look good and more prosperous in other ways, right? And so that kind of investment could only, I'm wondering where the real resources would come from for that kind of investment. I think the creativity is there, right? And the imagination is there, and the will is there, but they're bumping, I think, Black immigrant communities in particular bump up against some very real structural obstacles to that kind of thing. Sorry, you said one more, and I just
Just a quick comment that I live in JP, and I think it's what you're saying about it's branding, because we have the Latin Quarter, all of Center Street. Well, I would say all of Center Street, one portion of Center Street, Jackson Square, but they have to decide that this is what and of course, and not to discount that community's been there for a significant amount of time, probably back to the 50s. So, but there's plenty of opportunity for Haitians and, Jamaicans, could be like an island, like quarter, whatever. But we don't think of ourselves, I think, sometimes as having this cultural cachet to provide. We treasure ourselves, but not necessarily that other people will look at it and say, yeah, I'd want to go there, I'd spend money there. I mean, that's just my opinion. But I think we're definitely not branding and not taking ourselves as seriously as we could.
Yeah, and again, it's a complicated question, right? And thing to try to figure out what's next, right? What does the future hold for these communities and for these efforts of sustainable community building and growth, and also this movement towards seeing the Black community to having a kind of functional diversity in the Black community, right? As opposed to this sort of divisive or fighting for crumbs at the bottom, sort of multiple Black communities in Boston. And I don't know that there are moments where we've seen hints or gestures at that, but I don't know that it's come to fruition yet. Every time I come back to Boston, it is, it's a different place, right? I mean, it's like sand sort of underneath your feet in the ways the transformation is happening. But it's hard to say, I think maybe that's why I haven't finished the manuscript yet, right? Because I want to be able to say that this is where, this is what it's going to be. And as a sociologist, as opposed to a historian who can sort of deal with, well, we know how the story ends, and here, give me a good interpretation of what's going on. Sociologists sometimes feel like they've got to predict the future. and we want to be right. And I think the question of the situation, the case of Boston is complicated, but I think it's complicated in a way that speaks to other urban sites in the United States, and that if we can sort of keep an eye on what's going on here, or try to understand what's going on here, we're one step closer to that.